Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jen Zane, and I'm the communications coordinator with MI-CEMI. MI-CEMI, for those of you that are new to learning about us, we support the people and the organizations that are working on the front lines to improve public safety and end mass incarceration across Michigan. We know we can accomplish so much more together than any of us can do on our own. And so with that collaborative effort, we are a membership of over 115, give or take, organizations working in all areas across the state, from reform to abolition to faith-based service, direct support, advocacy, many areas. Next slide. The goal of this training today, as we introduce Dana later from Progress Michigan, is to do a deep dive on how to make the most out of organic and paid media channels. Then we'll have a discussion to follow. And the goal of that is for us to discuss MI-CEMI's vision for having regular gatherings of folks that are working in criminal justice reform to talk about messaging that they're struggling with, for us to share ideas, events that we have going on, trainings, and just to get to know each other and have a more cohesive, collaborative comms messaging statewide. So I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the help of my colleague that I'd like to introduce now. If you don't know Angela Davenport from VAAC, you definitely should. Angela is probably the queen of comms in Michigan. She can write copy, design flyers, websites. She can do it on the fly. Don't tell her I said that. But Angela's amazing. So I want to pass it over to Angela. She's going to tell you about VAAC, and then she'll introduce Dana.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction and for being able to be a part of this important comms convening today. I'm really excited about this kickoff. And for folks who don't know, that VAAC stands for Voting Access for All Coalition. And we were formed in 2020 to give a voice to those impacted by the criminal legal system. We feel voting is empowering, and we know that any barrier to voting, whether it be logistical, informational, or lack of trust, is voter suppression we must confront. So we work to ensure that all persons in pretrial situations, individuals about to be released from prison, those formerly incarcerated, along with our family members and community members, have the opportunity and knowledge they need to exercise their right to vote in every election. So that's a bit about VAAC. And next, I will go to, everyone can see our agenda and our upcoming events. Yes, there we go, upcoming events. So we have Michigan Megaphone Training and Content Brainstorm, and there is a link for folks to be able to register, and that's going to be Tuesday, May 21st from 7 to 8 p.m. We've done this training with VAAC, and I highly recommend it. And then we also have MI-CEMI member convening, and we're, again, I just want to say very grateful to be in partnership with MI-CEMI, and so their member convening is going to be on Thursday, July 25th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. There's also a registration link. And I'm proud to say that VAAC, the Detroit Public Library, and League of Women Voters Detroit will be hosting a conversation on jail voting. And that's going to be Tuesday, May 14th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. This came together quite quickly. So please stay tuned for the RSVP link. And I know that in follow-up materials, that will be included. And next, I would love to introduce Dana Sutton. Thank you so very much, Dana, for being here today. And if you don't mind, please take it away.
All right. Hi, folks. Happy to be here today. I love doing trainings like this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because naturally I have some slides. I'm going to go pretty quickly because I know we've got a lot to get through today, but feel free to stop me if you have any questions. This is a presentation that's mostly focused on digital media, but I did also consult our media relations folks. I'm sure a lot of you know Kim Hunter for a little bit of media relations stuff that's tacked on to the end here. I did a little bit of a Frankenstein's PowerPoint. So yeah, with that, we'll get started. Maybe I will. There we go. So starting off with just a few general reminders about social and digital media. The the first one is that there's a lot of stuff out there. Like there are so many tools and platforms and tactics. And I just want to remind you that you don't have to use all of them all the time. A lot of the time that's just too much. So it's important to be realistic about your organizational capacity. How much work can your team handle? How much money do you have to spend on this stuff? And make your plans accordingly. And the other thing I always like to highlight here is that not every idea you come up with is going to be a winner, and that's fine. This whole thing is a little bit of a crapshoot, and so sometimes you come up with an idea you think is going to be great and then it flops, and other times something that you think is not particularly special really does numbers. So just don't be too hard on yourself for the things that don't work out, because it happens to the best of us. So first, I've got some best practices for each of the main social media platforms that we use, starting off with Facebook. Facebook is definitely an older audience these days, but there still are a lot of people on Facebook. So as far as best practices for posting there go, it's good to use a lot of visuals, graphics, photographs, stuff like that, because that's the kind of stuff that people tend to share. It's always important to monitor what's going on in your comment section, but you don't have to feed the trolls. It's good to engage with people who are commenting in good faith, people who have legitimate questions, people who are supporting your work, stuff like that. That doesn't mean that you have to respond to people who are just being unreasonable and rude. You can always just you can block and report the ones that are being outright hateful, and otherwise just kind of let them be. Engagement is engagement. One important thing with pretty much all social media is that you want to make sure that the most important point that you want people to take away from your post is absolutely front and center. Because people tend to scroll pretty quickly. You're not going to have their attention for a very long time. And so you want to make sure that if they only look at your post for 5 or 6 seconds, that what they read is going to be this important message that you've got to tell them. Think about different ways that you can word your posts in such a way that encourages people to engage. You can ask questions of people, you can post challenges. And it's also good to just make sure that you're engaging with your followers, liking their comments, responding to their comments, stuff like that. Just making sure that, that they feel heard and important. As far as post frequency goes, it's good to post at least a couple times a week to be consistent. You don't want to post more than twice a day, especially as an organization posting from a page, because that starts to read as spam to the algorithm. And they don't like that so much. And the other thing that I like to highlight here is just to consider Facebook groups as an entire entity and how they might be able to serve you and your goals. Because I think that group-based content is one of the things that Facebook does particularly well. And most social media platforms, I think, don't have quite the same level of spaces like that. As far as the Facebook algorithm goes, I get questions about this sometimes. Yes, there is one. No, you don't have to understand it. It's honestly kind of a waste of time to try to understand it in depth because it's very complicated and opaque. You do want to avoid explicitly telling people to like or share your page and your content. Again, that just comes across as spam. And the platform has just been really liking video and imagery. So whenever you're able to incorporate that into your posts, it's always good to do that. And the other thing here is just to remember why people share content. I think on Facebook in particular, shares are one of the best and most beneficial ways that people can engage with your content, because they're taking this thing that you posted and then they're sharing it to all of their friends who may not follow you. So it's how you get exposed to a different audience. So think about all the reasons why people do that and craft your posts with that in mind. So Twitter, I still call it Twitter. Elon Musk can't make me change that. But Twitter is a place where you can post a lot. You can post as much as you want. It's not like Facebook where the algorithm is going to punish you. So just a few best practices are to make sure that your language is clear and concise. Try to tweet pretty frequently. If you've got updates to share every day, multiple times a day, this is a great place to do that. Think about the different ways that you can engage with other accounts. Obviously, you can retweet stuff that just shares it to your followers. You can also reply, and then there's also the quote retweet function where you can take somebody else's post, share it, but then add your own commentary as well. When it comes to hashtags, I feel like I get a lot of questions about hashtags, and that's reasonable. Um, I would say hashtags can be beneficial. They're basically just a way to like aggregate content. So if you click on a hashtag, then you get taken to a feed with like a whole bunch of posts that have used that hashtag. So really the best practice here is just to make sure that if you're adding a hashtag to your post, that there's a real purpose to it and that it relates to your work in some sort of specific way. One example of a hashtag we use a lot is the hashtag MILEG, as in MILEG, because that's been used for years as a tag for just like anything that's happening in the Michigan legislature. So in cases like that, it makes sense to use them. Basically, there should always be a reason why you're attaching a hashtag. You don't have to add them if you don't have any in mind that are particularly appropriate for what you're sharing. As far as Twitter goes, one of my favorite things about Twitter is the idea of live tweeting, which is basically just when an event is going on and you tweet updates throughout it. They're formatted as a thread so that, you know, people can follow the whole thing. They can go back and read every update you posted in order. And the reason why I think this is important is because there are a lot of people out there who care about stuff on some level. You know, they want to know what's going on. They want good policies to be passed. But a lot of these people have like whole other jobs, right? Like I spend 40 hours a week doing this stuff, so I have the time to watch these hearings, you know. I can spend 2 hours watching people in the Michigan legislature discuss a bill, but not everybody has the time to do that. And live tweeting is a great way to make sure that like those people can be engaged and can know what's happening, but without having to like spend all that time that they don't have. As far as like how to live tweet, of course, the biggest and most important thing here is to make sure that you're accurately conveying what's happening. You know, if you're talking about a legislative hearing or a press conference, you know, it's this person is speaking, this is what they're saying. This person asked a question, this was the answer. And once you get confident with that stuff, you can always try to add flavor, you know, adding GIFs and jokes and memes and stuff like that. But don't feel pressured to do that if you're still getting the hang of the first part. Because again, the accurate information is always what's most important here. So yeah, live tweet things. That's my pitch. Moving on to Instagram, this is where we get into like a little bit of the younger people platforms. As you all probably know by now, Instagram is a photo and video based app. It used to be just a photo app, and now they've got Reels, which is just TikTok, but on Instagram. So it's good to, you know, try a mixture of different kinds of visual content. Photos of actual people always do well, but there's lots of potential for various kinds of graphics, infographics, stuff like that. It's really good to try and create memes and also graphics that are inspired by pop culture stuff. Our rationale here is basically just that a lot of people are tired of hearing about politics. They don't necessarily want to like be told what to think or whatever. But sometimes when you create a meme, you create something that's inspired by pop culture, you basically take your messaging and you put it in a format that is familiar and appealing to people, and you can kind of like trick them. You know, it's like you're getting them to eat your vegetables by hiding them in a casserole or something, whatever it is that parents do. The Reels function is also pretty important these days. These are just short form videos, functions about the same as TikTok does. And I think the main benefit of Reels, in addition to like just allowing you to convey information in a different way than you can in graphics, the other thing that is noteworthy about them is that Reels get pushed out to people who aren't following you in a way that your other posts and stories generally don't. Oh yeah, I see a comment in the chat about hashtags. Yes, hashtags are, I think they come into play pretty much every Facebook does have hashtags. You can hashtag things there, but it doesn't seem like people use them or click on them as much. I would say they're most important on TikTok, which we'll get to in just a moment. But yeah, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, I think they're beneficial on all three of those. And yeah, as far as like the guidelines for using hashtags, I think for Instagram, the same ones apply as to Twitter. You just want to make sure that there's a reason you're adding a particular one and that it's specifically related to what you're doing. And yes, Reels work similarly on Facebook to how they do on Instagram and on TikTok and on YouTube Shorts. As far as I can tell, the algorithms for all of those different platforms seem to work relatively similarly. So most of our like short form video content for Progress Michigan originates in TikTok. What we tend to do these days is that we film it in TikTok and we download it before it's posted so that we have the video, but without like a TikTok watermark on it. And that way we can upload it to these other platforms without getting like dinged by their algorithm for posting something that came from another platform. So you don't have to record the same thing a bunch of times, but it is good to have the raw video with no watermark from anywhere on it. That way they can't tell. So yeah. As far as post frequency on Instagram, the data doesn't really point to any particular frequency that is the best, but it's good to be consistent, it seems like. So one downside of Instagram is that you can't post links in your posts, which is, I think, annoying to everybody for the most part. But you can put a link in your bio. So what we've been doing the last couple of years is that we created a Linktree account. Linktree is just another platform where you create an account and then you can put all of your links there. So the link in our bio always goes to our Linktree, and then we'll have, you know, our other social media, our website, you know, a petition if we've got like an action going, stuff like that. We can just put all of those in one place so that we can still direct folks to them. Also, once you have, I believe you have to have like 1,000 followers. There's a certain follower count that you have to reach, but then you can add links in your Instagram stories as well. And on the topic of stories, it's a good feature to experiment with. The deal with stories is just that they last for 24 hours. So they're good for like in the moment updates. And they're also a really good way to share other people's posts. You know, if you've got partners, you got allies in the same movement that you're a part of. Instagram makes it really easy to just like take their post, plop it on your story. So that way you're promoting what they're doing as well. So yeah, Instagram has a lot going on these days. It used to be so simple. Sorry, throat was getting a little dry there. So moving on to TikTok, it's become my personal favorite against all odds. When my boss, our old boss, Lenny Scott, told me that we had to start a TikTok, I thought he was kidding. I actually responded to his text message, "Are you joking?" He wasn't. It turns out that TikTok actually is a really useful platform. So a few best practices, and these really apply to most like video content, especially short form video. But I think the most important thing to consider is that you want to be authentic. I think a lot of people, especially when it's time to speak on camera, right? Like they go to record a video and they put all this pressure on themselves to sound polished. You know, you want to make sure that you're not stumbling over any words and that your tone is exactly right. And what happens, at least what happens to me when I try to do that, is that I wind up sounding like a robot. And I think that I don't think that's unique to me either. So I feel very strongly that it's better to speak naturally, you know, the way that you talk in conversations with other people, than it is to try really hard to make your delivery perfect. And so yeah, if you're ever recording TikToks, like I really do think it's best to just like deliver it the way that you would if you were talking to a friend, or like you would if you were arguing with someone, if it's that kind of point you're making. You don't have to worry a ton about super high quality video. The main things are just to make sure that the subject of the video is lit well and relatively centered in the frame. But you don't really have to do anything beyond that. You know, it's an app full of videos that people film on iPhones. Another thing, and this applies to pretty much all video content, is to include subtitles. This is good, one, because it makes your content more accessible and you're not accidentally excluding people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but also because a lot of people who are hearing scroll on mute. Um, So it just means that more people will be able to engage with and consume your content. TikTok also makes it a lot easier these days. You used to have to type them out yourself, but now they'll automatically generate them. And then you can just go in and edit anything that it's not quite picked up exactly right. As far as frequency here on TikTok, it's honestly great to just post as frequently as you can. The way that the algorithm works, and this is like a 10,000-foot view, is that when you post a video, and this also applies to Reels as far as I can tell. YouTube Shorts I'm a little perplexed by, but you post a video, and if you already have a follower base, you know, it'll get shown to your followers as followers, but it also gets pushed out to an audience of like roughly 200 people. And then the way that those 200 people respond to it determines if it gets pushed out further. So if that like initial batch of people who see it, if they're liking, if they're rewatching, if they're engaging with it and commenting and whatever, then that's when your video kind of like takes off and gets pushed out onto the quote unquote for you page. So basically every video you post is a chance for that to happen. And the thing that makes hashtags extra important here is that they help determine who sees your videos in that like first batch of people. I think TikTok generally looks at like the sound that you've used, if you've used a sound, the keywords, the type of content that you're sharing, and then they like show it to a batch of people who they think might like it. So keeping the hashtags specific and precise can help you make sure that like you're getting your stuff shown to people who are likely to enjoy it or to care about it. It's good to keep an eye on trending sounds in video formats, just you know, scrolling through your feed and seeing if there are interesting things that pop out. A lot of the time if I see a trend that like that I think might be useful, I just kind of like keep it in the back of my mind and see if I can think of a way to use it for our own purposes. As far as length for videos, honestly, kind of anything goes. I think there are benefits and drawbacks to each one. I think that when you post like really short videos, like 15-second or less videos, I feel like those tend to get more views, but then you're also not able to say as much. Um, so I think that, yeah, I think it's good to post a mix if you're able to, because a lot of the time, like when we share longer form videos, you know, like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, sometimes even a little more than that. You can post up to 10 minutes now, which is so much. But when you share longer form stuff, a lot of the time you won't get quite the same view counts as you do with your shorter form stuff, the stuff that's under a minute. But people tend to engage with it in a way that's like maybe a little more meaningful. So I guess I just look at it as posting a variety of links so that you have something for everybody. Like the short, catchy ones might help draw new people into your page, whereas the longer ones might give, you know, people who are already tuned into your stuff, it's an opportunity for you to give them like more information and kind of get them engaged on a slightly deeper level. And the other thing here is, you know, it's a cliche for a reason, but practice is important here. Filming TikToks feels really weird at first. Like I remember when I started, I was like, this is so dumb and embarrassing. Why am I doing this? But you get used to it. It's not so bad once you've done it a few times. So yeah, it's a thing you'll get a knack for, and it's all about finding the formats and the styles of video that work for you and that you feel comfortable with. That's generally going to be the stuff that other people respond to as well. We're not going to go through these video examples now, but I'll make sure that y'all get the slides after this. These are just a few like of our more successful videos. So now moving out of the like platform specific best practices and kind of zooming out to some more general conversations. So one thing that we've been talking about at Progress Michigan for, you know, years is trying to figure out how to make sure that our content stands out when there's so much stuff out there, right? Like people are seeing a constant barrage of media and posts and things like that. And so it's a constant challenge to try and make sure that our stuff is stuff that people want to look at. Um, Especially because like politics and social issues are not fun, right? Like they're not exciting to people in the way that like, you know, hobby content and movies and TV shows are. So it's always going to be a bit of an uphill battle. And what I think is the key to this is to just find ways to personality into what you're posting. Presumably like your colleagues, I don't think any of you work for candidates, but like the people who surround you, right? Like whatever organization that you're doing social media for, you've presumably got a bunch of people around you who are interesting people with their own perspectives and senses of humor. And I think it's important to use that, right? Like you're all funny, interesting people. Find ways that you can make sure that your posts reflect that. These are just a couple of elected officials who have had a lot of success with social media over the last couple of years. As far as, so I get a lot of questions about this, and they are good questions because it's an important topic. But when it comes to like tailoring your content to the different platforms and audiences, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all answer about any of this, but these are just kind of a few things that we think about. Um, Julia, I see your question in the chat. I'm gonna get to that in a little bit. It is a good question and something that we kind of struggle with a lot. Um, So as far as tailoring your content, because when you're posting on multiple different platforms, the audiences who follow you on those platforms might be a little bit different, and it's important to take that into account when you're deciding what to post. And honestly, the way to do this is just to observe over time what's happening on each of these platforms. Which posts are people liking, which posts are people sharing, which posts are flopping, and then try to figure out like if you can identify patterns. And this doesn't mean that you can't use the same pieces of content on your different platforms. A lot of the time that there is crossover appeal. So a lot of the time what we wind up doing is a lot of like graphics and images like we'll share across Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, but we'll tweak the captions a little bit. In a way that kind of reflects how our different audiences seem to like being talked to. And this is something that you just kind of have to get a feel for over time, because unfortunately there are never any set answers in such a complicated landscape. So group brainstorming, I always like to include this plug because we used to not really do group brainstorming at all. But it's really easy to get stuck into like a system where people are siloed from each other. One person is writing content, somebody else is designing it, somebody's approving it. But this doesn't always get you your best ideas, because when you take time to brainstorm with a group of people, it gives you a chance to kind of like workshop things in real time. Somebody will say, oh, what if we do this? And then somebody else has a little tweak to that idea. And then before you know it, you've got a much better idea than the original one. And the key to this is just to have a foundation of mutual respect. Because yeah, if people feel like they're going to be made fun of or yelled at for suggesting ideas that aren't good, then they're not going to suggest things. Remember that bad ideas are part of the brainstorming process. Some people like to say there are no bad ideas. I don't think that's true. I have lots of them. And it's totally fine that like not everything that pops into your head is going to be worth pursuing. So just like make sure that everybody in your brainstorming space is on board with that and okay with it. We also like to try giving people a few minutes to write down ideas and then make sure that everybody gets a chance to share what they've come up with. And that's mostly just to make sure that the people who are the chattiest don't wind up accidentally dominating the conversation, because quiet people have good ideas too. So as far as memes go, I mentioned memes a little bit earlier. So it's always good to pay attention on what's going on in your like personal feeds, and see how you can kind of use that stuff for your organization or your campaign. So these are all examples of like existing meme formats where all I did was add was change the words, add the captions to them. And all of these, I think all of these performed pretty well on our socials. Our Instagram audience particularly likes memes, but our Facebook audience has actually responded very well to them as well, which I was a little bit surprised by. And then these are a couple of like content ideas that are not exactly memes, but still tied into pop culture. So this was an example where Olivia Rodrigo, who's like a young artist who has had mega success in the last couple of years, she had just released her newest album, and a bunch of like kids on TikTok were sharing their glow ups. You know, this is what I looked like when she released her first album, and this is what I look like now. And so we decided to do that, but for Michigan. So when the first album came out, there were still all these bad things, bad laws in place. And now we managed to undo some of that. That and we've started using this burn book format. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with Mean Girls, probably not everybody. Oh, thank you. I like the Olivia Rodrigo post a lot too. I was very pleased with myself for that one. And the burn book thing is something we've actually started to use for accountability purposes. Like we've put some Republicans in there as well. This especially killed it on Instagram because our Instagram audience is primarily millennial women, and millennial women love Mean Girls. Um, so I guess this feels like a good time to go back to Julia's question in the chat, because I do think that's something we struggle with a little bit because we want our content to be interesting and entertaining, but there are some times where it feels inappropriate. And I think it's kind of just something you have to evaluate on a case by case basis. Like this is like a tough thing to figure out how to explain. But yeah, I think you want to look at each situation, because obviously like when you wind up in a situation with like, you know, where there's like domestic violence involved, there's abuse involved, there's like, you know, gun violence involved, stuff like that. Obviously, you don't want to get too cute with it. I think one thing that I try to consider when I'm coming up with ways to talk about issues that aren't quite that heavy is to think about who's the butt of the joke. Like if we're making a joke, who's the person being made fun of? Because we want to make sure that like we're punching up instead of punching down. So yeah, I this feels like a messy, rambling answer, and I also welcome anybody else's thoughts on this. But yeah, I think there are some topics that just aren't that memeable, right? Like there are some things that you just can't make into a meme in a way that is sensitive and appropriate. Um, and then when it comes to content that isn't quite that dark, yeah, I think it comes down to one, just like if you're ever not sure, I think it's good to bounce a post idea off of a couple other people, just because some of them might have flags that didn't come to mind for you. And two, to just always make sure that if somebody is being made fun of in your post, that it's very clear you're making fun of the right people. Um, Oh, we got a question about AI in the chat. And the answer I think is probably yes. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of specific insight into it because I haven't really utilized a lot of AI tools. I do know that Canva, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is my Lord and Savior, and also an online design platform for people who don't have a ton of design know-how. I know that they've got some AI features now as well, like one of the ones that I know for sure exists is that make a graphic in Canva, they have an AI like resizing tool. So like if you need a graphic in multiple different sizes and formats, you don't necessarily have to manually make that happen. You can make it in one format, and then the AI can help you figure out how to figure out how to it'll help you resize them. And yeah, I agree with what Skylar says in the chat here. Yeah, I think that comes back to the fact that like some issues are not memeable. um, and when you can't, when it's not memeable, I think the next best thing is to be earnest. Um, and forthcoming, I guess it's basically like a different form of authenticity, right? Because humor is one way of making things feel authentic and engaging, but emotion is another way. So, the kind of topic that makes you genuinely angry and upset and hurt and frustrated, like Palestine, I think maybe the alternative to humor there, because obviously, I agree that that's a situation where humor doesn't really have a place. Um, but instead you can kind of go with the approach where you make sure that the content you're sharing like really reflects how you feel, the genuine outrage that you feel about an issue like that. um so yeah, I guess that's kind of where I fall. But that is a good question, and it's something that we're like constantly trying to work through. Oh right, yeah, we got a couple more content examples. These are styled in the way of affirmations pages. There are affirmations pages all over Instagram. They just post like these weird little silly affirmation graphics. So we've kind of adopted that format for posts sometimes. Um, it seems like they do well, particularly when they're snarky. So that's just another thing that we've come up with. I can't take credit for that idea. That was another person on staff who came up with it. So yeah, getting into graphic design for non-designers. Yeah, I cannot stress enough how useful Canva is in this circumstance. It's free. Well, there is a free version. There's also a paid version that gives you access to more stuff. And I saw in the chat that apparently it's possible to get free access to that as a 501c3 nonprofit, which is great. But it's online, it's free, and it's relatively user friendly in a way that like things like Photoshop aren't necessarily. Obviously, like programs like Photoshop are a little bit more sophisticated. You can do more stuff with them. But if you're like me and you're not like a professional graphic designer, you can't do anything with them because they're too confusing. And Canva isn't really like that. They have a bunch of like free built-in tutorials, but it's also just a lot more user friendly, in a way that like you can generally figure it out even if you're not a big designer. And yes, I saw some love for Detroit Disability Power in the chat, and 100% agree with that. Because accessibility it's important in like every facet of what you do, but it's particularly important in graphic design, because you want to make sure that your designs are like accessible and readable to other people. So that includes stuff like including enough contrast in the color palette you're using for the image. And it also includes things like adding alt text, which just means alt text is just alternative text. It's pretty much I think most of the main social media platforms have a place where you can put alt text, and that's where you can just describe what's happening in the image. If it's a graphic, what does it say? What color is it? What's going on in it? So that way people who um are low vision are still able to like see what you're saying. And the good news is that Detroit Disability Power has a whole guide for this. It's called their Accessible Campaigns Guide, and I would definitely recommend seeking that out because they are the experts. They know a lot more about this than I do. And it really breaks down in depth how you can go about making sure that the stuff that you do, the work that you do, is accessible and that you're not accidentally excluding people. So when you're designing things, it's always good to keep things concise, and this is especially true in graphic form, because if you put too many words on a graphic, it starts to get busy and confusing. And think about ways that you can emphasize and call attention to like whatever's most important. If you've got keywords, if you've got like a tagline that's the most important phrase, think about how you can use like fonts and colors and things like that to make sure that that pops. So these are just a few examples of graphics that I made circa like 2018 and 2019. As you can see, nothing groundbreaking here, but they are like serviceable. um, you can probably tell that I have a very standard approach to this, where I pick a background image and then I put a transparent rectangle and then I put some text and maybe some more rectangles for emphasis. Nothing super exciting. They all kind of look the same, but it gets the job done. So yeah, Canva. And now we shift into paid media a little bit, because I know that that's a topic that people are generally pretty interested in. So one of the first questions that comes to mind when you're thinking about doing ads is, should I work with a vendor, you know, like a professional media buyer? And the answer, when it boils down to it, is really just maybe. The benefit of finding a media buyer or a vendor that you can work with is, one, you get less headaches because you don't have to do the buying. You're generally going to have more options for where you can place things and how you can target things, because the stuff gets really tech intensive really quickly. So when you're working with somebody with like a whole lot of expertise, you're going to be able to do more different things. I think most media buyers would tell you that using their expertise is likely to result in better reach and engagement and stuff like that. And most will do some sort of analysis for you after the buy is finished. Of course, the drawback is that you have to pay them. I think most vendors seem to just charge a set percentage of like the budget for the ad buy. So whether you should or you shouldn't work with a vendor when you're looking to do ads mostly just depends on how much money you have, and also how much like expertise you have on your staff and how comfortable people are with, you know, trying to place ads and do a little bit of media buying. So as far as where to run ads, if you're placing ads yourself, there are a few platforms, a few like major platforms that are self-serve. So you've got Facebook and Instagram, which is run through the Meta Business Suite. Um, Google Ads, those are actually pretty similar, I think, in terms of how the platform works. You can create an account for your business, they'll make you verify it. And then they'll have like a variety of different targeting options available for you. So those are platforms where they can be a little bit of a pain. Personally, I have a lot of beef with Meta Business all the time, but they're the kind of platform where like somebody without a ton of media buying experience or know-how can do it. Like you can figure it out, you can place ads yourself without needing to consult a professional media buyer. The other option here is that if you want to do like some form of quote unquote programmatic display ad, what that means is just like all of the ads that show up on websites that are not social media. So, you know, if you're reading a news article and there's a little skinny banner at the top or like a banner down the side, those are programmatic display ads. One way that you can kind of do that is if you know of like an online publication or a website or something like that, where you know that the people you want to reach are likely to be on there reading stuff. That's another way you can kind of go about placing ads, is by contacting that publication directly and saying, hey, like, are we able to buy ad space on your website? And in a lot of cases, they will be open to that. They'll give you some specifications and then you can kind of work with them that way. And then if you're working with a buyer, the other options that opens up are programmatic display ads in general. And basically what a buyer will do with this is that they have relationships with a bunch of like different vendors. There's like layers and layers of vendors. But they'll have relationships with a bunch of the different people who like control the inventory, right? Like, because there's a certain amount of inventory across all kinds of websites, and a media buyer will generally have the connections where like they can just kind of put your ads all over the place in a way that like we can't really do ourselves. And then the other thing is pre-roll and or OTT ads. OTT is an acronym that stands for over the top, as in over the top of the cable box. I don't know, I didn't name it, but that just means anything that people are watching on a TV that isn't cable. So, you know, stuff like Hulu, the HGTV app, HBO Max, you know, all the other different places where people might be seeing ads, but like on the TV. And those can be really useful, especially if you're looking for like persuasion, because people tend to watch the whole thing. They're obviously very bad if you're doing something where your goal is to generate clicks, because people aren't going to click on their TV. But yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of just like the main options for where you can put ads. Then we get into targeting, which is also very fun and a little bit confusing. So one option is that you can target based on a list. If you've got like some sort of target universe in Van, You can export that from the van, you can upload that, and then you can target those people directly. So that's always an option. Another option is that if you have some sort of like a membership or subscriber list, like of people who are already with you, they're already subscribed to your stuff. One thing that Meta does for sure, I'm not sure if this is available on other platforms, but you can use that to generate a quote unquote lookalike list, which basically means they'll look at this like data that you've uploaded of your subscriber list, and they'll look at the characteristics that apply to those people, and then they'll try and find a bunch of people who share at least some of those characteristics so that you can target people who have some similarity to the people who you know are already with you. Of course, there's also the option of targeting based on geography and demographics. So, I want to target people in this county, I want to target people in this house district, whatever the case may be. And of course, all of the demographic information. You can, target people based on like age and political leanings and all that jazz. Oh yeah, thank you, Chuck. I forgot that not everybody knows about Van. Honestly, I don't know that much about Van. But yeah, there's a C3 van that Michigan Voices runs, and then a C4 van that I believe America Votes kind of heads up. But yeah, it's a big old like a database that a lot of like field programs and stuff use. But it can also be used to target digital stuff. So yeah, thanks for reminding me to explain that. So yeah, you got the geographic and demographic stuff. And then also most of these self-serve platforms have some form of like interest-based targeting, which basically there's all kinds of interests they have. It's all the creepy data stuff where all these data mining companies, they look at like your browsing habits and what you're looking at online. Well, you can kind of leverage that for ad targeting. So you can find ways to kind of like approximate the audience that you're looking for, because there are some groups of people that you can't necessarily target directly. One example we've come across before was that we've worked with Detroit Disability Power a couple times, and obviously like the audience they're most interested in targeting is people with disabilities, and you can't target disabled people directly because that's like a HIPAA violation. Like that's not that's legally not okay. You can't do that. And so instead, what we would do is find some proxies, people who engage with a lot of disability related content, people who have an interest in disability justice, stuff like that. So when you're, oh, good. Thank you, Zach, for adding that in the chat. I haven't used Google Ads as much directly, but they have a lookalike feature as well, and also an exclude feature. Thank you. I appreciate you lifting that up. So yeah, that's kind of like an overview of what's going on with targeting. I think the best way to go about this is you basically want to start by asking yourself, in a perfect world, like if I could just magically reach exactly the audience who I want to reach, who would that be? And then if it's something that you can just sum up in simple characteristics, that's fantastic. If it's something that you can't quite do that with, then you can kind of think through like, okay, well, what kind of like factors can I cobble together that might allow me to approximate that group? And then you just want to get as close as you can to that. Okay, so ad creation is also a whole fun thing. So obviously the first step when you're coming up with any kind of a program is you want to figure out what your goals are, what your primary goals are, how you prioritize them. Because of course there are multiple different things that you can accomplish with a digital ad, right? Like you can get general visibility, you can get engagement, you can get clicks to your landing page. And all of those are good and they're not mutually exclusive, but it's also good to know which of those things are most important to you on a particular program so that you can prioritize things accordingly and make sure that like your targeting is set up to optimize for what it is that you're going for. So then you want to figure out what messages you have to work with. So what are the facts on this issue, this candidate, something like that. How you can tie the issues back to fundamental values. That's, good messaging best practice. How important the various issues you have to work with are to your audience and what direct impact they have on people's day-to-day lives. And you do also want to know your audience and keep them in mind when you're creating the content. you know, what do you know about these people? What are they interested in? What motivates them? And how can I like reflect that in the ads that I'm making? So then you kind of come up, once you have messages, then you have to turn those messages into creative, whether that's video, images, what have you. So obviously one of the big factors in this part is which platforms you plan to utilize, because they all have their own specifications and kinds of things that they require. Think about, you know, if you're doing like video ads or ads with images of people, think about whether there are particular messages who are well suited to messengers who are well suited to deliver your message. Think about how you can potentially tie the visuals or the vibe of the ad to people's interests outside of politics. And of course, you want to think about what resources are available to you, right? Like if you know, like if you're doing video ads and you don't have like a whole videography team, as you know, most people don't, you know, you want to think in terms of like, okay, maybe we do face to camera videos. Maybe we keep it a little bit simpler, as opposed to like drawing up some sort of like beautifully complicated cinematic 30-second ad that you don't have the capacity to make. So I do have an example here. I picked this one, I bring this up a lot, mostly because I feel like this kind of like illustrates this process really well in a way that a lot of programs don't. So the first part was that we had to figure out some messages for this. And because like the Office of Secretary of State deals so heavily with voting and voting rights, we knew that was going to be a big part of our narrative. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't care that much about voting rights. And that's not good, obviously. They should care about voting rights. But to a lot of people, like they don't necessarily feel so tangible, right? Like a lot of people, I think, would say that they think voting rights are good, but they don't really understand the threats that exist to voting rights. Um, so we also wanted to look at other options that we could push out alongside the voting rights messaging. And one thing we realized was that during Benson's tenure as Secretary of State, she made it a lot easier to do things online. Like the percentage of services that are available online now compared to the percentage of services that were available online in like 2018, it's been a big jump. And we were like, wait a second, this is gold because people hate the Secretary of State's office. I know I do. And so we came up with a variety of different concepts that kind of depicted people going about their daily lives in different ways that we could use to emphasize how easy it is for people who are busy to do things like vehicle registration online. So we have, you know, this woman doing a face mask. We've got a mom with baby. We've got this dude at a sports bar. We got this lady with her cats. And then we also we also have this horoscope version. And this was an interesting plot twist that 2022 took for us, where we were looking at a certain like data set that we have where we were able to kind of like look at some of the top interests for various groups of people in Michigan. And we realized that people really like astrology. Like a lot of the key audiences that we need to be targeting, like the base audiences, are really into horoscopes. And we were like, okay, well, sure then. Like if people are that into astrology, we can do astrology, right? So we took our messaging and we just kind of dressed it up in this cute little astrology looking format. And this wound up being one of our best static ads of the entire cycle, which again, I didn't really expect, but I'll take it. And one thing, and another thing I feel strongly about is that when you come up with something that works, it's great to think about how much you can milk that, right? Like, so we wound up making those for more candidates, more issues. We also expanded into a video format. So that was just the same thing. See some mouse clicking on the horoscope, you know, just a little animation so that you can use it more. No, don't play it again. And then this one got a little bit more experimental, and it was relatively late in the cycle, so we don't have as much performance data on this one. But I like to include it in this presentation, one, because it's kind of fun, and two, just to kind of illustrate like how you can take ideas and then expand them. So this is a Ouija board ad. Ta-da. So yeah, there's that. So yeah, one note before we shift into the little media relations portion of this presentation, is that a lot of the same principles that we use to like develop interesting and compelling ads, it's the same kind of line of thinking that we use to try and develop interesting and compelling organic social media posts. And so I just want to highlight that those don't necessarily have to be like entirely separate things. Like if you've got something that works, if you've got something that works really well organically, it's also probably going to work well if you put a little money behind it. And same thing if you've got ads that you're running that are working well as ads, you can also like, you can work those into your organic content as well and just be sharing the same stuff that works through multiple different channels. So yeah, now we got a little bit of media relations stuff. Sorry, the style has changed because again, Frankenstein's PowerPoint. So these are just a couple of notes on engaging with reporters. Oh, we got a message in the chat. Yes, thank you, Chuck. Yeah, sorry, those were a little bit more C4-y things. So yeah, remember, reporters are not your enemies. They're also not your friends. So when you're dealing with reporters, you want to make sure that you keep that in mind, that you're not getting too cozy and comfortable with people, and also not being too adversarial. You want to, because like you and a reporter, right? You might have some similar goals and values and qualities, but you also have kind of different roles, because your role as somebody who's talking to a reporter is that you're trying to push out the message and the narrative of your movement and your organization, and a reporter is there to like they work for the paper. So they're there to get a good compelling story, and those things can often align, but they also might not. um Yeah, I saw a message in the chat about sending questions via email. That's also a very good option. Remember that reporters are also just human beings. So being courteous, being kind, can go a long way in like building relationships. Because again, they're not your friends. You don't want to get too comfortable, but you do want to have like a good working relationship. Because if they like you, if they know you, if they're comfortable with you, they're going to be more likely to like come to you when they need a source about something. You can offer to meet up with them, and it's also good to stay in touch. You know, you don't just want to reach out when you need something from them. And I think that's true of pretty much any kind of relationship. Like if you're only getting in touch with somebody when you need stuff, they're going to notice that and they might resent it. So it's good to find little ways to stay in touch, and just make sure that it doesn't feel quite as transactional as it might be. Um, and you always want to remember that the media is not your primary audience, right? Like the media is a conduit between you and your audience. So just always keep that in mind, even though a reporter and like the media broadly is who you are kind of who you're talking to in the moment, you want to remember that they're not ultimately the people you're trying to persuade or convince of anything. Those people are the people who are consuming the media. So you just always want to remember what dynamics are at play in your head while you're talking to reporters and while you're engaging with the media. So you got multiple different target audiences, and of course, the way that you communicate with those different groups of people are not going to be exactly the same. So of course, like the media and reporters, they're not your audience. They are kind of an audience though. And the way that you communicate with them is going to be a little bit different than when you're communicating directly to the people. Also a little bit different from when you're communicating directly to decision makers. And so this just comes back to knowing your audience. and knowing that the way that you talk to like a lay person who is not as familiar with the issue as you are is going to be a little bit different than the way that you would talk to somebody who's an expert in the field. So just always consider who you're talking to in a given moment, whom you're trying to convince of things, and talk to them in a way that reflects that. Yep, this is just a good reminder to find people's social media handles. That applies to both decision makers and reporters, and don't be afraid to tag them and stuff. Obviously you don't want to be tagging them with like hate-filled vitriol. I don't think any of you would be doing hate-filled vitriol anyway. But yeah, find ways to tag them, to engage with them directly, and also to keep up with what they're doing on those platforms. So then we have, this is just like a little bit of useful message guidance. We call this the messaging trident. And this is just something you want to keep in mind when you're making a statement, when you're drafting social media posts, stuff like that. Obviously, I think a lot of people tend to instinctively focus on what is happening, what are the facts. But you can't only rely on what's happening and what the facts are, because at the end of the day, people are not entirely rational as much as we want to think that they are. And so if you just give people a barrage of facts, they might, they might listen to you and then be like, okay, and and that's why it's important to also talk about why something matters. Think about the fundamental values that are important to people, right? Fairness, justice, responsibility, equity, things like that. And make sure that you're tying your messaging back to that. Because as always, yeah, you want people to understand like why you're saying what you're saying and why they should care about it. And then the other thing to tie in is what can be done, what kinds of action are available to us here. Because again, people don't want to feel hopeless, right? Like if you just tell people these bad things are happening and they matter because you appeal to their compassion and you tell them there are horrible things happening, right? That might make them feel a little bit hopeless or disaffected. So you also want to make sure you tie in what can you do about it? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And it's important that you kind of intertwine all three of these things. And that's kind of how you go about creating a compelling message that really can reach people. This is just a reminder. Wow, I did not make this slide originally. I quite enjoy this little image though. This slide is mostly just about how you want to make sure that you've got both the short-term and the long-term view, and that you are considering both of those things when you talk, especially when you talk publicly, right? Because you probably have like short-term goals most of the time, like for like an organization that may be like, my short-term goal is we want to pass this piece of legislation. We want to pressure the city council into doing this particular thing. We want to gather petition signatures on this particular issue. But just remember that like your short-term goals aren't the entire world, right? Like you want to think about like not only how can a message help me achieve what I'm trying to achieve right this second, but also how can we make sure that we are building a longer term narrative. And actually I think that goes back to the whole concept of narrative, which I don't know if any of you have ever been trained in the hero's narrative or just like had a conversation with my colleague Kim. I could talk about that for hours, but the main principle there is that you have like an overarching narrative, ideally, right? Like, who are we? What are we trying to accomplish in a very broad sense? What's our vision for the future? That's a narrative. And then underneath the umbrella of that narrative, you have campaigns, right? Like you have, I want to accomplish this specific goal. I want to accomplish this specific goal. And then your messages kind of fit into that. And so I guess what I'm getting at here is that you just don't want to miss the big picture by zooming in too closely on what you're thinking about like right this second. It's important to consider both. A few things to remember when you're talking to the media, when you're posting on social media, really any form of communications. Don't be afraid of repetition. I think sometimes people don't want to sound like a broken record, but actually a big part of communications and a big part of convincing people over time is repeating your main messages. Because if you post the same talking point on social media every week, right? Like it's probably going to be different people who see it each time. And so, yeah, you just don't be afraid of repeating the stuff that's really important. Um, we are big fans of the phrase, it doesn't have to be this way. That goes back to the messaging trident and to the action oriented aspect of that, because we want to remind people that yes, things are bad sometimes. Yes, bad things are happening. Yes, you should care about that and be outraged. But also, like, we have the power to reshape these systems. And, we can create a better world, a better future, a better system. And so, just keeping that in mind and making sure that we're reminding people of that. Okay, I see there's a question in the chat. I will get to that in a moment or two because yeah, it seemed like a good question. And I want to give it my full attention when I'm not looking at a slide. Sorry, I'm bad at multitasking is really what this comes back to. Who's to blame? Again, this is another big principle of the hero's narrative, but there is a villain, okay? Like in every situation of injustice, there's a villain. It's somebody's fault, right? And we want to make sure that people know whose fault it is. Like, a lot of the time, and I feel like 90% of the time it winds up being either corporations, corporate interests, corporate greed in general, or like a more specific corporation like Enbridge or an entity like Betsy DeVos. But you want to make sure that you're explicitly naming that, because if you don't explicitly name whose fault it is, then people might assume the wrong thing, right? Like a good example of this is how, sorry, I don't want to go too far on a tangent here, but if you think about the concept of, immigration as it relates to the economy, right? Like a lot of right wingers work really hard to demonize the immigrant community and kind of like encourage people who were born here to blame them for like stealing your jobs. The reason why you're poor and exploited and whatever is because of XYZ marginalized group. And of course, we know that that's not the truth, right? Like when workers are being exploited, when people are living in poverty, when people like don't have upward social mobility, the reason for that is because they're being taken advantage of by corporations. And so we want to make sure that we are explicitly saying that we're explicitly like connecting those dots, because if we leave people to connect the dots themselves, they might do it wrong. We're also very big on not using the other side's message. I think this is a trap that I think like various groups on the general American left fall into sometimes, where like, conservatives have been really good about message discipline over the last couple of decades, and so they've created a narrative that's really familiar to people. One thing that I think is a good example is the idea of like cutting taxes and demonizing taxes, right? Like that's a right-wing framework where they say, taxes are bad, the government's stealing from you, right? Like you shouldn't have to pay taxes, we need tax cuts. And sometimes people on the left try and like co-opt that and make it work for us, and it just doesn't. So make sure that like the messaging that you're using, rather than just trying to like take that narrative and make it work for you, make sure that like the messages that you're saying are rooted in our own fundamental values and in our own narrative. And the other reminder here is that if something isn't polling well, that doesn't mean that you can't talk about it. Obviously, like this is a pretty nuanced topic, but if something doesn't pull well at a particular moment in time, that doesn't mean that you have to give up. That just means that you got work to do. And this is just a slide about being really particular and precise with your language and making sure that we're using the words to like empower people. So this government and economy bullet point is mostly about the fact that so government, we talk about in heroes narrative trainings a lot, because government at the end of the day is a tool. It's not an inherent good thing. It's not an inherently bad thing. It's not the hero and it's not the villain. It's a tool that can be used for good or for bad, depending on who's in control of it. And the economy, we also, we try to avoid talking about like the economy as sometimes people talk about the economy as if it's like a mystical beast that we have to appease. It's just like some sort of magical force that's happening on its own. When in fact, the economy, it's a system that's shaped by the decisions of people in power. And we want to make sure that we're talking about it that way. that and avoiding passive voice. There are situations where passive voice winds up being appropriate, but most of the time you want to make sure that you're speaking actively. Like someone didn't lose a job, like a corporation laid them off. You know, someone who was like harmed by police, right? Like rather than saying they were hurt, you say the police hurt them, the police beat them, things like that. Uh, oh, that is awesome. Uh, Definitely click on that link that Chuck in the chat because that looks really useful and I'm gonna peruse it as well. So that's all the slides. I'm gonna get back to that question in the chat. Oh, another good question from Skylar. Thank you. So sarcasm, I think it depends on a few things. One is your organizational voice. Like, so at Progress Michigan, where I work, we have always been a little bit snarky, and that doesn't mean that everything we say is snarky, but like it's always been a part of our brand, I guess. So I think that's part of it. Like I've also worked, I worked once at an organization where like they didn't do that at all, right? Like the way that they spoke on social media and in their public communications was extremely proper and polite, and that was, you know, that's fine. That's what they were doing. And so yeah, I think that yeah, so I'm reading your points about sarcasm, and I think that what you want to come back to is I tend to find stuff like that funny too. I think when you're messaging about like politics and issues, you just want to make sure that it's clear, right? Like I think that sarcasm can sometimes be misread. It's a sorry, there's a meme that comes to mind of like it's like a dude in a bro tank top. It's satire requires a clarity of purpose, you know, to avoid being confused for the thing that you're satirizing. So I think, yeah, you just want to think critically. If you work for an organization where like sarcasm can be part of your organizational voice, then I think you can and should go for it, especially if you're talking to young people, because that's kind of like the way that young people operate online. Um, and yeah, I think you just want to think critically on a case by case basis, like is there potential for this to be misread? Like I have sometimes had ideas where I'm like, oh, this would be really funny to me, but I can't say that because I know it's like too niche, it's too specific, and it's not going to be read the way that I want it to be read. So yeah, I think yeah, case by case basis, I would say.
Dana, I'm just popping in for a little bit of traffic control support. First of all, thank you so much. I've been doing communications for a long time, but I still learned a lot. Amazing content, and you covered a lot of territory in less than an hour. So thank you, or for hour and 15. So thank you so much. Excellent work. What we're going to do is we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. So you can either raise your hand, come off chat, or put it in the chat, and we'll call on you. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. After that, we're going to take a quick bio break, and then hopefully some of you are going to stay around for more of a roundtable discussion on how we, as folks who are doing communications specifically around the criminal legal system in Michigan, can support each other, network up, and increase our impact together. So that's what's coming next. I see Sutina up with hand raised. So you're up next. As you ask your question, also just give a quick introduction to yourself and your organization. Just name an affiliation so that we get a chance to meet each other as well. All right, you got.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sutina Green. I am the Life Without Parole Project Manager with Human Rights Watch, and I oversee the National Life Without Parole Leadership Council. We're a national organization, so we do have members there in Michigan. One of our members, who you all should know very well, Danny Jones, was one of our members as well before his passing. So I had a quick question. We are going to be launching finally. We're, you know, a new organization. Human Rights has been around forever, but we are a branch of them. And so we've been around just a little over 2 years now, but we finally are going to have a website that up and running. And so I'm tasked with, you know, trying to get the website out there. And so my question is, do you know, I've been asked to like look into LinkedIn and Facebook, like ads, Google ads. what's the best way besides word of mouth and like advertising on social media to drive people to the website? So the website is going to be about life without parole. We'll have, survivors of crime on there. We have people who were formerly sentenced to juvenile life without parole and life without parole. It highlights our council. So, it does a lot of different things, and there's a lot of great resources on there, but I'm not sure how to quite advertise to pull in people who are not familiar with this kind of work, and also people who are in this work. What's the best way to advertise when promoting a new website?
Okay, so I think as far as ads specifically go, I think that you might want to look into finding someone who can help you place some programmatic display ads. I think those wind up being useful for click-throughs specifically. I'd also recommend taking advantage of like the network of people who you've got here, because they probably all have their own like subscriber bases and stuff like that, who might be interested in this, and can kind of like distribute it that way. Yeah, I think really like it's good to have a variety of different tools that you're using, because I think each of them are going to reach different people. So obviously it depends on your capacity, but I think like a mix of organic social media, pushing some of those digital ads, and also just like utilizing all of the networks that you have, um, the different organizations that you're in community with, and finding ways to kind of like collaborate with them as well. I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you.
And just to help you with the multitasking, we'll keep an eye on the chat so you can focus on the verbal content. Kenneth put in just a shout and encouragement to folks. Done is better than perfect. So just getting your content out there is better than worrying. Don't let worrying about all the details that Dana shared stop you from getting stuff out. In the chat, Lawanda also asked, how do you feel about QR codes?
Yeah, I think in some situations QR codes can be really beneficial. I think anytime you're at an event in person and you've got like flyers that you're handing out, or you've got like a poster on a table that you're at, I think QR codes are really useful in that respect. That, and if you're ever running any form of like OTT ads, the kinds that show up on the TV so that people can't click them, I think that QR codes can also be useful there, because they give people a way to kind of follow that link. So yeah, I think they're a little bit less useful on some social media platforms, because a lot of the time if you're sharing on social media, you can just like add a link that people can click on. But anytime that's not an option, like anytime you're in person, or you're dealing with like physical media, then I think it's great.
Thank you. Waiting to see if anybody else has chats either in the questions, either in the chat or online. And Skylar asked, how big should a flyer be? And I'm just going to add into their question that, at MI-CEMI, sometimes we're posting things online and we're wondering about formats for social. Often we'll have print flyers for events as well. So the related question is, how do you manage different flyer sides to make sure you're getting all your right audiences on the different platforms?
Yeah, so I think the main difference between like social media graphics and flyers is that you generally can fit more stuff on a flyer, because people are going to be like holding it and reading it as opposed to just scrolling past it. So I think social media graphics, it's best to keep it simple, boil it down to like the absolute most important information. You could even add multiple graphics in a post. Like if you're posting on Instagram and you want to make sure that like all or most of the information you would have in a flyer is available in that post, you can post it just like as a series of graphics where people can scroll through, and it'll just look a little bit more manageable to them. As far as like how big flyers should be, I think it depends. It depends on how much information you want to convey, because you can hand out full sheets to people, you can hand out half sheets, quarter sheets, whatever. So I think it really just depends on like how much stuff do we have that is essential to tell these people, and then like what size do we need in order for it to be readable? And of course, like, I guess it also matters, like, how much money you have to print stuff if you're working with a printer. Unfortunately, I'm not the printing person. Actually, very fortunately, I'm not the printing person at Progress, Michigan. But yeah.
Thank you, Dana. I see Kenneth with a question, Tori with a question, and then I've got a question of my own, so I'm going to get in the stack as well. But Kenneth, you're up next.
All right, thanks, Dana. My question is related to not social media platforms that are on a platform, but if you have a website for the organization and you're posting there, I wonder if you have any experience to the value of like what's the best way to get attention onto a website that people aren't going to be able to scroll by it in the same way that they would on social media. So would you refer people from social media, or would you prioritize making sure things are showing up in search results or anything else like that?
Yeah, I do think the search results thing can be useful, the whole like SEO thing. I don't have any detailed knowledge of SEO, but there are people with expertise who, there are probably sources out there that could help you do that more effectively. The other thing that I want to highlight, this is actually something I learned from another, like an out-of-state affiliate of Progress Michigan, like that's part of our national network. They have had a lot of luck with posting things on Reddit. I have not experimented that much with using Reddit for work purposes, but I remember them saying that they've used it a lot when they managed to get like op-eds and things like that placed in other newspapers. Like they'll post it on like appropriate subreddits and it gets a ton of clicks and people actually read the article. Like people on Reddit, a lot of the time people on Reddit will actually like read a whole thing, which is a little bit interesting and unique. So that's another option. If you've got like subreddits that are either related to like a locality that you're dealing with or an issue that you're dealing with, posting it there, because that'll also help you get it like to a group of people who are interested in this specific thing. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. They've had a lot of success getting more, because now like newspapers and stuff like want more of their stuff because it's getting so many more eyes. Yeah, Reddit, magic, wild platform.
Excellent. Tori has a question. Go for it, Tori.
Hi, Dana. Tori Price, program coordinator for Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration. My question is, over the next couple of weeks, I may be talking to the media about subjects that are very passionate to me. So as a someone who has been impacted by the criminal justice system and also an advocate, like what is that balance when talking to the media about something I'm very passionate about in regards to my experience and or as an advocate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I hate that respectability politics probably play a role in this because I think that they're bullshit. Yeah, I would say, and I hate even advising on this at all because again, I think all of these like systems that police how people talk about their own experiences suck. But with that caveat, I think sticking to emotion, how like therapists always like to say use I statements and not like you statements. So I think making sure that you're conveying like your experiences and how they've affected you, as opposed to like a more, I guess, adversarial message, might help with people being less judgmental of how you're speaking. Yeah, God, you should be allowed to speak with as much emotion as much emotion as you fucking want to. But yeah, I think that's what I would go with, is focus on the impact on you and like you as a human being and how your story has affected your experience.
All right. What I love about that question too is it sets up the conversation we're going to have after the break about how we as folks who are doing communications on these issues can support each other, whether it's on figuring out messaging, group brainstorms, working out, finding those balances person by person, org by org, case by case. So stay tuned for after the break so we can talk about how we set up that kind of support table for each other. Last question for Dana. I see Skylar, you've got one in the chat, but I'm not sure we're going to get to that one. Sorry. Oh, and more people are coming in. I love it. Okay. If I'm feeling good energy, so if folks are okay with it, I'm going to suggest maybe we go to 12:45. Is that going to work for you, Dana? Okay.
Yeah.
So we're getting good Q&A here, so we're going to go a little bit longer here. Go with it while we can. Somebody sent me a question in as a direct message as a small shop. There's all the things they could do, but only a few things they've got the capacity for. What advice do you give for orgs that have a minimal capacity on social media?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. One, I think a lot of it depends on who your audience is. If you're like a youth-based organization, I would say focus on TikTok, focus on Instagram. So I think that there's a fair amount of data out there about like the constituencies of the various social media platforms. So I think that's probably where you want to start, is figure out like who am I trying to reach, and then do your best to figure out where they are. And the other thing is I think tailoring content to different social media platforms is great. But obviously like it's great when you're able to. So one like visual that we I find myself using a lot is like sort of like a hub and spoke model. So think of it as like you got this thing that you put effort into, like maybe it's a press release, maybe it's an op-ed, maybe it's a piece of creative, like a video or something. Think about all of the different ways that you can utilize that. You can share it like a bunch of times. You can share it more than once because people aren't going to always see it the first time. So think about ways that you can kind of like use the effort that you've already put in, and just put it more places. So yeah, I think that's kind of what it comes down to. Yes,
Thank,
recycling is great.
thank you. And Skylar asked about lighter and humorous content and how that balances between organizations with official sounding names versus individual organizations. And I guess I'll also add to that a question I had of for platforms like TikTok, does it matter if it's an individual account as a person or if it's an organizational account and there's different people in front of the camera on that organizational TikTok?
Yeah, so I think that lighter and humorous content can have a place on media accounts with like official sounding names. I think like honestly, all kinds of serious media outlets have like jumped into the fray because they've kind of realized that that's the way that like online communications are going, is to a place that is unserious. So I think it mostly just depends on the specific organization, the specific page. Because again, I think every organization kind of has its own identity. So it kind of depends on like your boss, how they feel, your funders, your board, how they feel about like how your organization operates. So it's really a case by case basis. As far as TikTok goes, so we have an account that's been very successful where we do have multiple different people on camera. But also a lot of the time I feel like in our individual videos, we tend to like speak as individuals, if that makes sense. Like actually for the longest time when I started the platform, I was the only one posting like 95% of the time. And I think sometimes people did think that it was an individual person. Um, Even though like our account name was Progress Mish, and I think somebody thought like some people thought my name was Michelle. I don't it was like a whole thing. Some people were very confused. But yeah, I would say I think that you can do an organizational page with multiple people on camera while also feeling authentic. It just comes down to letting each person express themselves in a way that like feels true to them. Like if you watch the videos from like different people on our pages, we each have our own like manner of speaking, our own inflection, our own words that we tend to lean on. And so I think allowing people that freedom can kind of preserve that sense of authenticity while still operating as a brand.
Thank you. And Cosine asked about profiles on social media of employees or people within the organization as get to know the people involved. Curious how you've seen those play out for folks you've worked with.
Yeah, I think those can be useful, depending on how much buy-in you have from staff, if they want to be on camera, if they don't want to be on camera. But yeah, I think it can be good. When I'm doing stuff like that, I try to think about ways that we can tie it back to like our organizational message. So like maybe if we're doing a profile on like a particular staff member, we might ask some frivolous questions. We might, get their opinions on some pop culture stuff, and then also have them talk about like, an issue that's important to them or why they get into this work. But yeah, I think that can be good because again, it goes back to like the authenticity thing. The reason why influencer culture is so big is because people like to feel like they're hearing from a person, even if what they're hearing from is actually a brand full of people. So
Excellent. So those were the questions I had. There was also some people were asking in the chat, is this content going to be available? We do have the recording. We will share the recording with everybody. Before we close this down, I'm going to make sure I save the chat so we can get some of the resources people. We're putting out there. Dana said that the slides will be available too, because I saw some good links that I'm going to be wanting to follow up. So this is all going to be available to you. Oh, Angela slipped in one more question before we break. So recommending on thanking social funders on social. Sort of what's the good etiquette there and what's considered proper?
That's a good question. I think if you're ever talking about like small dollar donors and stuff like that, I think you should 100%, you like can and should 100% thank them. If we're talking like bigger funders, I think it depends on who the funder is. I would definitely run it by your funder. If there's a particular person you want to thank, make sure that they're cool with it. Yeah, I would say if you're being like funded or fiscally sponsored by like, you know, an organization that's in the same movement that you are, then that seems very cool. Yeah, I would say just a case by case basis. Think about the optics, like whoever the funder is, think about like if people see this, are they gonna think it's sketchy? Are they gonna not think it's sketchy? So yeah, just use your best judgment there.